Okay, I'd like to call to order this council training meeting on Wednesday, March 6th, 2019. And I'll start with disclosure of pecuniary interests. All right, seeing none, I will hand over the floor to Nina for our FOI training.
Okay, good morning. So we are here to provide an overview of MFIPA and FOI. And so before I start, I'll just clarify the two acronyms that I'll be using throughout. MFIPA, as you know, stands for Municipal Freedom Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And FOI stands for Freedom Information. So with the new term of council, we believe it's prudent to provide you an overview of MFIPA. Certainly our municipality has seen an increased number of requests over the years, increased complexity of requests, length, and the number of appeals, which seems to be the overall trend with other municipalities as well. So we think that it's prudent for council to have an overview of MFIPA along with some tips and tricks to protect information and privacy. So we'll start off with MFIPA 101. As you know, that is a legislation that oversees access to information and privacy laws. IPC is the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. They are the oversight body for the legislation. They are the agency that you go to if you'd like to file appeals. If you don't believe that you've received the right answer from a municipality. And also they issue orders that assist municipalities in interpreting the legislation. One of the main tenets of MFIPA is, of course, access to information. Anyone can submit an FOI request for records relating to township business. Does someone have to be township resident in order to submit an FOI request? No, absolutely not. They do not need to be. So anybody can have the right to access of information. They can have the ability to access their own information and to correct their own information, which is within the municipality's records. The other tenet of MFIPA is the protection of privacy. So the township, including all its employees, have a responsibility to protect personal information. So we must only collect minimal information, which is related to the activities that we're collecting it for. And then we should only share that to whoever needs to know. As an example, as part of our building intake process, we would never collect information such as a health card number or social insurance number because that doesn't relate to the activity of a building permit. We only collect information such as the owner's address, their names, and information relating to the building permit. So we have a responsibility to collect only what we need and then to use it in the way that it was intended to be when it was collected. So what is personal information? It is identified in MFIPA. It does say that it's a recorded information about an identifiable individual. There is a longer list in MFIPA of some examples. I've only provided a few examples here just to sort of give you an idea. So it's information relating to race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, information relating to criminal or employment history, any identifying number, symbol, an address, a telephone number, and etc. So that's just an idea of the type of information that's protected. But if anyone is interested to read the full list, I would be happy to sit down individually and go over it with you. I wanted to give you an example of personal information. Later on in the afternoon council meeting, you have a delegate request on that agenda. And as you will notice in our delegate requests, we redact personal information of the people. So their address, their email, their phone number. The only thing that we leave is their name and any information relating to the actual delegation. So that is the way that we protect their information when we post the information online. So now we're going to quiz you, because who doesn't love a quiz at 9 a.m.? So the first, there's just 4 questions. The first question is email sent out from my personal, and I say my, I mean you as members of council. Email sent out from your personal email account are not subject to MFIPA. Is that truth or myth?
Maybe.
That would be a myth. Emails sent out from your personal accounts, if they are relating to township activity in your role as a township councillor, are subject to MFIPA. So we'll go through that more in a little bit later, but that is a myth. Second one is documents or emails you created outside of the township's business hours are not subject to MFIPA. Truth or myth? Myth, correct. It doesn't matter, and certainly with councillors' hours, your hours are not set, so it does not matter when you created them or as you will see where you created them, as long as they are township activity and in your role as a township councillor, they are subject to MFIPA. The third one is I am a township councillor and I can get any township employee's name and home address. Myth or truth?
Myth.
Myth, correct. Our employees have the right to confidentiality as well. And then,
We corrected that then?
I'm sorry,
Have we corrected that situation? They used to appear on the councillor shared drive.
correct. We no longer provide that, and I will double check the drive to ensure there's nothing in there.
Thank you.
And then the last one is I'm a township councillor and I can obtain the identity of any bylaw enforcement officer complainants. Is that truth or myth? Myth, correct. The identity of a bylaw complainant is confidential and a councillor does not automatically get access to that identity as part of your duties, and therefore that is information that is confidential, and our CAO will give a little bit more information about that as well.
I just wanted to, I know this is regarding FOI training, but I just wanted to point out that when it comes to bylaw enforcement complaints, the only other thing to also bear in mind is that when you liaise with complainants or the person that's being complained about more particularly, and if the matter moves through the process, just bear in mind that if you're corresponding with that individual, you can very much be called as a witness. Okay?
You guys did great on your quiz. Okay, so how and when does MFIPA apply to councillors? So as I mentioned, your records are considered part of township records when you are dealing with township matters on behalf of the township. So to simplify, if you are creating a record as a councillor on behalf of the township, if you're doing township business, then it is subject to MFIPA. And regardless of whether you created that record on our computer, on your own personal computer, whether you're storing it on our email or your personal email, those records are subject to MFIPA. Anyone can ask for them, and you are obligated, you have an obligation to preserve those records and to allow staff access to them when we do receive an FOI request. And you're also obligated to properly handle the record and protect any confidential and private information that is within those records. Your records are not subject to MFIPA when they are relating to your private matters, emails to do with your family life, emails to do with your family, emails to do with a personal business, interactions for campaign-related activities also are not subject to MFIPA. I've put a little clause in here that says unless you're using township hardware. I want to make it clear that when you are using township hardware, it is considered part of our record. So anything that you do on our hardware is considered is considered subject to MFIPA. However, using township hardware for campaign-related activities is a contravention from the corporate use of resources policy. So I just wanted to add that in there.
I have a quick question, Nina.
Sure.
So are we not to delete any emails?
No, I have a slide later on. Absolutely regular, proper maintenance and of your emails is actually recommended. That way you have the most recent emails, the most up-to-date emails. No one's expecting you to keep records from 4, 5, 6 years ago. So by all means, we actually encourage councillors to clean up the emails regularly and keep the relevant information on there. It's, and one of the slides up here, future slides will say it, when we receive a request though, at that point, do not delete any emails during an active FOI request. That's the only thing that I would say. So following on that, council records, just to give a little bit more examples. So examples where your records are subject: email sent to staff, email sent to council, email sent to voter responding to, let's say, a concern about a pothole on a road or anything to do with a facility. Records relating to your involvement on an agency. We recently appointed all of council as members of committees and boards, so certainly any correspondence of your involvement as a councillor on that committee or board is subject to MFIPA. Examples that are not subject to MFIPA is, like I mentioned, communication with your family and friends, anything to do with the business, or correspondence to do with your campaign if you were talking to a private sector company or to a resident with regards to the campaign. So with respect to processing FOI request, when we receive an FOI request, the first thing that will happen is you will receive an email from me letting you know what the request is and what the information is that you have to search for. We just ask that you act quickly. A municipality has 30 calendar days to respond to that request. So when you receive the email from me, just act quickly. As I mentioned, do not delete or destroy anything relevant to an active request. That can be seen as a breach of privacy. So make sure that you provide the township with any applicable records. Do not share any confidential information about an active request. Requests are meant to be confidential. Do not share information about that we have in a request, what is it for, or any grounds such as that. That is all confidential information. And whenever you're unsure, please feel free to contact township staff, and we will certainly assist in any questions you have. The one thing that I will mention is it is important that you do a thorough search, because township staff is not searching your record. We're not searching the server for the applicable record. So it's up to each member of council. The onus is on you to do a thorough search of your records and to provide us with anything pertaining to the request. So the next slide just looks at ways that you can minimize MFIPA impact on yourself as a member of council. So think ahead and use precaution. I think it's really important that you separate your private and political matters wherever possible. And later on, we actually suggest use your township account to do township business. Use your private account to do your private business. It'll just make things easier for you. It'll be easier when we do get FOI requests, if you separate the two as much as possible. Minimize unnecessary involvement into township operations, such as we mentioned, active bylaw enforcement files. The less that you're involved with that, the less impact you might have later on for yourself in terms of MFIPA and in terms of legislative proceedings, as Karen mentioned. And as I mentioned earlier, clean up your emails later. It's absolutely acceptable and recommended that you clean up and that you maintain your emails and that they are up to date and that you have the most up-to-date records in there. Just some best practices for councillors. Under MFIPA, a councillor can only access records limited to perform his or her duties. So the information that we provide you with is meant to directly assist you in your records. As such, you shouldn't have tremendous information that you shouldn't have a lot of information that would be confidential, that would be difficult for you to process. But ensure that all your decision-making processes are transparent and that your records are properly documented and preserved. I think that the last point on this slide is really important. Avoid using text messages or social media to conduct township business. It's not an accurate record. It's not an easily traceable record. It's not something that you might keep a track of, but a resident might have it as a record. So I would say if you are conducting township business, I really can't stress it enough, use the township email. It's the best way to have a transparent process, and it's the best way to keep track of all of your records, which might then be required to be accessed through FOI. A few more best practices. When sharing personal information with township staff, ensure it's needed for their duties and vice versa. So ensure that the information that you have collected and the information that we're providing you is the information that you need to carry out your role. When sharing personal information, ensure that the individual has consented. So if one of your residents is sending you information with respect to their property, any concerns they may have, ensure that they are consenting to you then forwarding that information to us. One example that I would give you, or one piece of advice I would give you, if someone is contacting you with respect to a bylaw complaint, I would say don't forward their information. Don't say I'm going to pass this on to staff. I would say have them contact staff directly. That way we will collect the necessary personal information that we need from them, and we will ensure their privacy and the protection of their privacy in that scenario. If you receive a township document that's labeled as confidential, please don't share with the public. Obviously, that's in your code of conduct. As members of council, you receive a lot of confidential information, and it's really important that you do, in fact, keep that information confidential. And as always, please consult our staff. If you have any questions, we're absolutely more than happy to assist in interpreting MFIPA. And that is all the information I have for you, so I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Neela. That was great training. Any questions, Councillor Palmer?
Yeah, thanks. You talk about keeping emails for a period of time, but not keeping them for a long period of time. I have some questions around that, because is there any statute of limitations for when someone could apply, make an FOI request for an issue?
No, and there's no specific guide in terms of, delete emails that are a year old or et cetera. Certainly our server allows us the capacity to keep a fair amount of emails. I would just say be prudent in deleting be prudent in deleting emails that are quite old. I would say that because there's no specific guideline, it's up to each councillor to ensure that you are really keeping track of the most relevant information. However, someone could submit an FOI request for, let's say, a building permit from 1972. So there's no statute of limitations in terms of that type of information. However, if they ask for an email that you sent in 82 or whenever was your first term of council. If you do not have that email as a record, then you don't have it as a record, right? So we just say we no longer have that. So certainly do your best to keep your email updated, and certainly do your best to delete emails that you feel are no longer necessary without us having a specific timeline of when you need to delete those.
'Cause I think of things such as the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act as a 7-year statute of limitations. People could request on that basis, but I also think of, those of us, I'm sure many of us do regular backups. I keep a backup of my laptop,
Yep.
and I mean, I don't know, I've never looked to see how far back they go, but, they periodically overwrite.
Yep. Yeah, I think
There's
it's
a
just
good chance those records will exist even if I delete them now, a previous backup of the computer would still have those records.
Yeah, I think it's pertinent to whatever information is being backed up, that when you are searching for an FOI request, that you are searching that backup as well, is what I would tell you. Any information that is part of on your hardware, it is still considered FOIable. So even if it's not actively in your email, if it is in a backed up hardware, it is still information that should be searched as part of a request.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Super, thank you.
you're welcome.
I'll just add something just for council to just consider. As Nina has indicated, and the same applies to staff in terms of emails. And we have to make sure that we classify records that aren't necessary, that should be in the system, but perhaps it's good to be mindful of making sure that you're deleting those emails that would be considered transitory in nature.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then that just helps scope down the records that you have to search if Nina has to request some records from you. And I think it is also fair to say that during the township or any other municipality typically gets requests that deal with a member of council's term. So I would just be mindful of that. So they usually don't tend to go back beyond the current term of council when they're requesting records if they're dealing with if they're looking for records that a councillor or the mayor has created or responded to. And the only other thing that I just wanted to point out is just because in my past life in another municipality, this came back as a privacy complaint, is just when you're responding to emails to constituents, and if you happen to include an email of another constituent in that response, that could be a privacy complaint.
Oh, dear, yeah.
Okay, because you're giving that constituent's personal email address out. Maybe not knowingly, but if you happen to add someone on to an email that you're sending to someone and their address is there, that can be considered a privacy breach. Well, it has been considered a privacy breach. So just be mindful of that as well, okay?
All right, thank you. Councilor Goyda?
I just have a question about that, about the sharing of email. If you are, let's say you receive an email that comes from a specific individual but has like 3 or 4 other people copied on that email that comes to you, and you respond to the group, that would be considered okay because
Yes.
it's come to you with all that information. Okay.
But if you forward that email
To somebody
someone
else?
that's not in that group,
Without their
without
consent.
their consent,
Okay.
that could be considered a privacy breach.
Okay, and I just also want to clarify on something that you said in terms of if we get an email with some sort of concern about any issue, you are saying that we should not be forwarding that email to township staff?
No, I was just saying, make sure that you have their consent, that you're now sharing their personal information, such as their address, their email with our staff. So I would just ask them that they consent to you then
Okay.
forwarding to staff. The one scenario where I would suggest that you have them contact us is with respect to bylaw complaints. I would suggest not forwarding that information. I would ask them to contact our office directly,
Okay.
and we will then take their complaint and we'll collect all the personal information that we need. It just makes it a lot of a cleaner process. However, with any other concerns that you get absolutely forwarded to us, just ensure that they are consenting to you forwarding that personal information to us.
Okay, and the last thing I wanted to ask is, I am often emailing things from myself to on my township email to myself on a personal email, just so that because at home I don't have a printer that has Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Is that in any way a problem?
No, no. I think I would be cautious with confidential information that you receive as part of your duties and where you store it. If you are sending it to another computer, another email, I would just be very careful with confidential information and how other people may be able to access that.
Yeah.
However, forwarding an agenda to your own personal email account is perfectly acceptable. Just keep in mind that that record is now, the record that you sent to your personal email is now part of
FOIable.
FOIable.
Okay. Time to upgrade our printer, I guess.
Thank you. Councillor Spillis?
Yes, I have a question with respect to the email protocol. If I send an email out today through the township's server, and when do you back up your server?
I think that the server is regularly backed up through like a firewall, a company that regularly backs it up, but I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly how often that is done.
Okay, because in my previous life, if I sent an email today, the IT department backed up everything. In spite of me, the next day deleting the email, it's still on the backed up server.
It's still part of the server, correct,
Yeah,
yes.
So I'm wondering if you have that same protocol here, even though I may have deleted at home, there a copy resides on the server, and is that then still accessible for me to do a search?
A copy is on the server, and our IT department on serve could assist in obtaining that in a search. Where it becomes difficult is, I know we've talked about this before, we don't have the ability to search the entire server. For example, if I were to search the entire server for emails pertaining to a keyword, let's say I get an FOI search on PCC and I do that, then I would not be able to do that. But certainly our IT department will be able to assist you in recovering any deleted emails that are on the server as well. And if you need clarity on how long things are held on the server, I can certainly obtain that in email council.
Because that's the other question I was going to ask is, if I have something on my email,
Mm-hmm.
and 3 years from now, I try calling it up, it actually tries to communicate with the server to call it up.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is that still accessible 3 years from now?
Yes, and I will get in touch with OnServe to get some correspondence sent to all of you in terms of what the quickest way is to access that information, whether to do it yourself or whether to call them and to obtain it. So I will certainly get back to you on that.
Okay, Councillor Roth?
I have no questions.
All right, thank you, Nina. I appreciate your training, and I have no questions.
I have one follow-up, if I could.
Councillor Bulmer?
We had a discussion last year about letting people know that what they send us is subject to FOI, these requests. We were talking about, it's in the body of our emails, and on the signatures of our emails that we send them, there's a thing
Yes.
advising. But I noticed there was nothing on the website. If they went to the township website, and we discussed adding something to the township website, that when they fill out that form, just to advise them that anything they submit to us through that form
Yes.
would be subject to FOI. Has that been done?
Yeah, so we had a chat about that, Councillor Bulmer, and I certainly did add a disclaimer. Because it was last year, I can't exactly remember which part of the page I added it on, but I did add a blurb, and I think it was under council and committee, where I said that all of the information that they provide to us is subject to MFIPA. So I did add a blurb on there, yes.
On that page where they submit,
Yes, and all of our online forms, so we've been in the process of creating fillable forms in the last while, and so, for example, the delegate request form and a lot of other forms have been sort of automated to be easily fillable online. All of those forms also have an FOI disclaimer on them at the bottom. So we've been trying to, in as many places as possible, put in the disclaimer when people are filling out information.
thanks so much.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you.
All right, I'll invite our county planning staff down to the hot seat so we can have our Planning 101. Good morning.
Good morning. So look at all the extra time we have.
You're going to fill it, aren't you, Sarah?
Oh, I don't know. I could. Have you all met Michelle? Yeah?
Earlier.
Okay, oh, you did. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. So we're a team together, and that's why we're both here. I'll start into the presentation, but just in terms of format, we're both happy to answer questions throughout. I think that might make the presentation a little more engaging by having other people stepping in and also giving you a chance to ask questions when they're relevant to whatever we're talking about. So please feel free along the way. We wanted to make sure that this was relevant to you and the burning questions you have about planning, anything you've ever wanted to know, we're here. So the agenda is just on the first slide there, very simple. Just talking about broadly planning in Ontario and the structure that we have, and then a little bit more about planning in Puslinch. So it will be more of a bird's eye view, but like I said, we can dive in deeper as needed. Guess I should advance my slides. All right. So the main takeaway from the introduction slide is that this is a province-led system. It is hierarchical, top-down. You've maybe caught a flavor of that from the presentation last week about the provincial growth plan and how that impacts places like Puslinch. Municipalities still play a very critical role in as decision makers. And I think, again, throughout the presentation, what I'll try to do is answer the question. Someone that I worked with for many years used to ask, who's driving the bus all the time? Because things can go off the rail when you don't know who's driving the bus, even in individual relationships in the office. So we'll try to make that clear too. So starting in with dividing into the entire province, and then we have parts of the province and then municipalities. So the Planning Act is the key piece of legislation that tells us what we do and how we can do it in the planning realm. There are a lot of other pieces of legislation that touch on planning and weave into it that you all know. Aggregate Resources Act, for example, the Heritage Act, but today we'll just hone in on the Planning Act. So this legislation sets out the ground rules basically for land use across the province. Generally, it describes how land uses may be controlled and who may control them. Then we have the provincial policy statement. That's also a province-wide land use policy document, and it provides policy direction on matters of provincial interest, management of growth and development, use and management of resources like aggregates, or also prime agricultural land. And also it deals with the protection of public health and safety. So that would be things like hazardous lands, floodplain, that sort of thing.
If I ask a question there on the PPS.
Yes.
You said it provides direction regarding items of provincial interest. So when the Places to Grow, I think it was the Places to Grow Act, talks about creating these provincially significant employment lands, then that would, those things would then gain protection or mention in the PPS then as becoming provincially significant, and there'd be policies adopted or written in there for that?
I can't answer that for sure until that amendment is finished, but right now the growth plan is an example of a policy document that only applies to part of the province, so the area they've termed the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So it's possible that they might not enshrine that into the provincial policy statement, and that it'll only apply to the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So we'll see.
Well, it's interesting because the Aggregate Resources Act only applies to Southern Ontario, but it's part of the provincial policy statement.
True. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. And this is an important term in the provincial policy statement, shall be consistent with. And those words have great meaning for all of us, because land use planning decisions are required to be consistent with those policies. Many years ago, it used to be shall have regard for, and that's when we had more flexibility around that. But they've changed it, and certainly within the last 10 years, the province has clearly become more involved in regulating planning in Ontario and in our area too. And again, these policies are implemented through decision-making by Puslinch and by the county. So moving into provincial plans, in Wellington and Puslinch, there are 2 plans that apply. We've got, as we all know, the growth plan, and that applies to the whole county. And it's a vision established by the province within that mapped area on the slide for where and how that area will grow. And overall, the intent is to minimize sprawl, requiring more compact development, not just the primary reliance on single detached dwellings on larger lots that we've traditionally seen, and also intensification in built-up areas so that land is used more efficiently. So that would be areas within urban areas where they've already been developed, looking for ways to provide more development where services are already located. And then the Greenbelt Plan map is shown to the right. That currently applies to Puslinch and Erin, and it generally provides more protection to natural features, natural heritage features and water resources, and protection of the agricultural land base. Particularly for Puslinch, because actually on the next slide I've got the official plan map that shows how it applies in Puslinch. It takes in Morriston and the southern part of the township. Among other things, and I'm going to use a lot of planning weasel words right now, as it stands today, the way that the 2 plans work together, if you read the growth plan and the Greenbelt plan, the Morriston, because it doesn't have existing municipal water and wastewater systems, it won't be allowed to grow. And so that's why there's a limitation there. And as I mentioned at our last presentation, the Greenbelt Plan isn't on the table for revision as part of the amendment to the growth plan that they're currently considering. And moving into the official plan, the county, a county-wide official plan was prepared back in 1999 when amalgamation occurred, when we went from 27 down to 7 municipalities in Wellington. Most of the municipalities in the county chose or opted to use the county plan as their local official plan. 2 of them, Centre Wellington and Erin, have their own official plans. In Centre Wellington, they've chosen to have official plan policies for their urban areas, and Erin has elected to have it for their entire municipality. Just in general terms, that policy document shows us where new housing, industry, offices, and businesses will be located. Tells us where and in what order the county will grow, and what services will be needed. Of course, that's very high-level view. That policy document is one that we reach to daily and frequently throughout the day in the work that we do as planners. Of course, there are also policies for lot creation, and that's one of the areas that Puslinch sees the most development activity, so I know it's probably pretty near and dear to your heart, and we can talk about those in more detail later. I'll touch on severances. Bottom line here is that all land use and servicing decisions must conform to the policies of the plan. And in terms of how Puslinch used to have its own official plan prior to amalgamation, and local policies were brought into the county official plan in 1999 to recognize special areas unique to Puslinch here, such as Puslinch Lake, Mini Lakes, Mill Creek, industrial policies, you have your economic development policies as well. Those are some of the ways that your unique circumstances are recognized in the county plan. And I've included the land use schedules for Puslinch in the presentation in case you might want to refer to them, but also just to illustrate the fact that land use designations apply to every piece of land within the county and within the township. Personal pet peeve is people do have a tendency to confuse the word designation with zoning. So land use designations are found in the official plan, and zoning is found in the zoning bylaw. Each of the land use designations, the different colors on that schedule, have corresponding policy objectives and permitted uses in the plan. And this is the schedule for Aberfoyle, and then Morriston. Moving into the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw, again, in this hierarchy, it takes the policy direction and guidance from the official plan and implements it into the zoning bylaw, which regulates the use of land. It's organized broadly into definitions, general provisions which apply across the township, and then individual zones which apply to properties. There can be multiple zones that apply to individual properties. And again, broadly speaking, it controls how land and buildings can be used, where buildings and uses can be located, things like lot sizes, dimensions, building heights, lot coverage. And bottom line here is a building permit cannot be issued without zoning compliance. And a little bit of background, you've got a shiny new zoning bylaw just ready to ready to implement, and this was done over a period of time by Stantec and MLS Consulting. They've brought you into the modern world of zoning, updated and prepared a new bylaw that is much more user friendly. It's modernized. The definitions are brought up to date. It's been adopted by council, so all the heavy lifting has been done, and it's currently under appeal. But we're just waiting on that. So we're continuing to use the 1985 bylaw. I did want to, I've provided a couple of slides here. This is the mapping that applies, and again, much like the land use designations, your municipality is divided into different land use zones. And then in the gray areas, those are detail maps that will highlight the zoning in areas that have more dense development where the mapping can't show it well. So that covers off special areas like Puslinch Lake, your urban centers, and some of the other industrial and residential subdivisions outside of the urban areas. The zoning bylaw is also helpful in providing appendices that provide other information so that it's kind of a one-stop shop for people. They can look into the appendices and find out where the Conservation Authority regulates their property, where the Greenbelt Plan area is. There's a new environmental protection overlay that applies, and that picks up the Greenlands policies in the county official plan. So the current natural environment zoning captures the core Greenlands, and then you've got that additional overlay. There's a map or schedule that addresses the floodplains, and then also industrial design. So that picks up where the design guidelines also, what it's done is it's taken design guidelines and enshrined them into the zoning where it was appropriate to do that. So moving into minor variances. So council is the decision maker for zoning bylaw amendments, and I guess when talking about minor variances, I'll refer to a zoning bylaw amendment as a major zoning change, and a minor variance is a minor change or more of a tweak to a particular standard in the zoning. So only council can decide or is the approval authority for a zoning bylaw amendment. But for small changes or adjustments, a committee may decide. And that's called a committee of adjustment, and that's where the name comes from. And in Puss Lynch, the committee is made up of citizen appointees and a member of council. Planning staff attend committee of adjustment to provide our planning advice. And again, taking the bird's eye view, we could probably speak for a great amount of time on each of these application types, but generally speaking, there are 4 tests that need to be met for a minor variance, and those are laid out in the Planning Act. And in our comments, we'll provide an evaluation of the 4 tests. But you also have, or the committee also has the opportunity to consider them on their own and consider input from members of the public that might attend, and agency comments and staff comments that will come in. Land division. Moving into that. So land division refers to 2 things. Basically, it's lot creation or division of land. You have subdivision or condominium process, and you also have what we refer to as consents. That's what it's called in the Planning Act, but more commonly referred to as severances and lot line adjustments. Subdivision or condominium approval authority rests with the county, as does consent. It's generally delegated to the planning director, provided that there aren't any conflicts or disagreements. In Puss Lynch, new subdivisions outside of urban areas, or actually across the county, they're no longer permitted. So Fox Run Estates, yes?
I stuck in my head there. When you said the consents are delegated to the head of planning, I thought it was a committee that made the decisions.
Sorry, you're right. I'm just going to get into that. What I was trying to say is that the county has approval authority for both types of applications, and yep, you're right, and I'll try to.
Some do delegate it to a staff, to the head of.
Yep.
But
Yep.
We've kept it a committee, right? Okay.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yep, sorry. I skipped ahead. So I just wanted to clarify that estate residential, whatever you refer to them in your own verbiage. We have a few different ways of referring to them, but the estate lifestyle community subdivisions are no longer permitted. They were removed about 10 years ago when the growth plan came in from the province, simply because that was the policy direction at the time. So they will be allowed to build out if there's a current designation or current approvals on the books. So I think Fox Run Estates Phase 2 will I haven't checked in on that lately, but that'll, I think, be finishing up. And then also the Morriston development will continue on. But there are limited opportunities left in Puss Lynch for residential development within Aberfoyle, Morriston, and Arkell. Arkell does have some land. There's an old subdivision on the books under the name of Kukavika, but that one it hasn't had any activity in over 10 years, and it wasn't complete at the time that it came in. And other pre-consultation work that we've done have indicated that there are water quality issues. So I'm not sure if it doesn't look good for development in Arkell either. Then moving into consents.
Just before we move on, I had a question
Yep.
on that too.
Sure.
So, new subdivisions may not be allowed. What about redevelopment of an existing, let's say there was a small subdivision with a half a dozen lots, and that someone bought it and decided they wanted to have 12 lots instead? Is that a process where you have greater intensity within an existing, or would that have to be done through consent?
I think we would have to look at that on an individual basis, just to see what the land use designation is and what the zoning permits and whether there are any technical constraints. So we would, we're happy to do pre-consultations and look at opportunities to do something like that. I know in the past, a 1 acre lot minimum is kind of an industry standard, and that's what we look for in the rural area. But in subdivisions like Morriston and some others that I've dealt with, half an acre seems to be achievable because the technology has improved for septic systems, but that's when they're developed together as a comprehensively planned subdivision, and where they're putting in enhanced treatment systems. And it's possible, and we could certainly look at it.
I have a question as well. In the growth plan amendment that they're proposing, it says that if we can adjust the urban boundary with no net gain, if there were a possibility for Aberfoyle per se to move the boundary to get the floodplain out of it and add some developable land, I mean, that would have to conform to policies. Would that be doable, or would it still fall under the fact that we can't have subdivisions? It would have to be individual severances. In theory, I guess it's in theory.
No, I mean, these are the kinds of questions that we need to talk about for sure. It's good for me to have them in the back of my mind, so that when I'm looking at these things as they progress, I know what you're looking to do. We filed our comments on Friday. It's been a bit of a busy time, and what remains to be seen is where the final document will land, where the province will end up with that amendment. When I went to the provincial roundtables, there were other municipalities that were asking questions about, can we net out natural features? Can we, is it 40 hectares measured across the upper tier, meaning we have to slice it amongst 7 municipalities? And, there's one question. The next question, if we have 21, don't quote me, how many urban centers we have. Actually, it's less than that. But how many urban centers we have across the county, can we divide it further amongst that? And if you multiply that out, it's actually quite a sizable sum if you multiply 40 hectares by all of our settlement areas. And is that what the province intended? I'm still getting to my answer. At the end of the day, the province has indicated that it still needs to be justified in the municipal comprehensive review. And the municipal comprehensive review is basically when we have a deadline of 2022 by the province to bring all of our work into conformity with their plan, with the growth plan. And until we know what that amendment actually says, I'm hoping we'll have a bit more clarity around some of the questions that you're asking. I don't know, but at the end of the day, if it has to be justified through the municipal comprehensive review, I don't know that we'll be able to justify the expansion, because we have an allocated population to Aberfoyle to expand. So it's quite complicated to kind of cycle your way through all of the different things that we would have to look at, and the servicing constraints that you have. But I guess the good thing is we all care about Puss Lynch, and we know the struggles that you have, and we'll be looking at it in that lens. But our hands will be tied probably to some degree around that. So I'm sure I'll be back here at some point in the future to talk to you about that issue and how the amendment all played out when it's been completed. Okay, so in terms of the moving back into the severance process, thank you, Councillor Bulmer. It's the County Land Division Committee that the decision rests with, made up of members of County Council. Application intake and processing occurs through the county office. I'm sure you get numerous calls here, and we have many calls for inquiries at our office, as Michelle can attest to. We, meaning Michelle, attends the Township's Planning and Advisory Committee meetings where new applications are discussed, and as Councillor Sapoulis can attest to, there's a municipal commenting form that is circulated to all of our municipalities so that we can get your feedback on key issues and get a sense of your position on the application. That form is important to Land Division. We and the committee cares about what the municipal position is on the applications that they deal with. I would say that I've been dealing with, not recently, but I've dealt with severances in Puslinch for quite a few years, and the volume and the complexity has just increased. I think, again, because of the province taking a more active role in planning in Ontario and particularly in our area with the Greenbelt Plan and the Growth Plan. Those inquiries are really tough, and it sometimes it feels like all of the easy lots have been taken, or maybe it was just that the policy framework was easier. And so what we're seeing now are some pretty strange looking lots in terms of their configurations, their frontages. It's quite a puzzle sometimes to be able to meet all of the different requirements and end up with a buildable lot, a viable building lot. In some cases, you particularly, again, Councillor Sapoulis being chair of PDAC, we're starting to look at asking applicants to pursue minor variances or associated rezoning applications before they do their severance. So either we're meeting with them in pre-consultation and saying, these issues are so important that we need to know answers before we look at creating the lot, because maybe the lot won't be viable, or maybe the configuration or the size aren't supportable by council or by your committee of adjustment. It's of course possible to condition those things. So our Land Division Committee quite commonly will place a condition of minor variance or a rezoning, but we're finding, again, because of particularly natural features and other things, that we're finding we need to do it first. I know that, with change, probably some consultants would prefer to not see it go that way, because they would prefer to have the certainty of an answer from Land Division before they put out the expense of a zoning application or a minor variance. I guess to that, I would say, there are lots of municipalities in Ontario that have a system where their Committee of Adjustment and Land Division are one and the same group, because of, for example, Mississauga, or large municipalities that have authority for Land Division, where they would have to apply for them at the same time, and they would have to submit all of the required studies. So, sometimes I would just say that people are fortunate if they're able to get the certainty of a conditional approval and then proceed down the road. But other times, it's that complex or constrained that they have to put forward the additional study to justify their application. And again, the bottom line, we don't want to create a lot that isn't viable, and we also don't want to pass problems down to the municipality and put you in a tough spot where you might not like the decision, and then you're left with an application that you might not have otherwise wanted to approve or deal with. Did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to say further on that note is that it does give, when the rezoning or the minor variance comes to either the Committee of Adjustment or to Council first, it actually gives us at the county, when we're wearing our county hat, the opportunity to get the local perspective as well. Instead of, as Sarah was saying, instead of sort of the top-down approach of us reviewing the consent first up at the county level, this actually gives a chance for either council or the Committee of Adjustment to weigh in on it and identify some of those issues. And it also it gives the public that opportunity to hear that application in this format as well too. And it really it takes it, as Sarah mentioned, that many municipalities do have the opportunity to run those two processes together. And in this case, I know personally, I think we benefit from having the opportunity to have the discussion here. And as Sarah mentioned too, that many of these consents are getting more and more complex. And sometimes there is that distinction as well too between the rezoning and the minor variance, because using the rezoning method, we can actually hold a pre-consultation meeting and request any necessary studies that we see we need in advance to determine the viability of that lot, versus the minor variances. Sarah mentioned earlier, sort of the major versus minor. The minor variance, we'd be more into conditioning those studies. So it might sound like a subtle difference, but it actually gives the opportunity for the local municipality, for Puslinch, to really either endorse the application or not. So then what happens for Land Division Committee is that the Land Division Committee actually has a clear decision coming from the township saying, yes, we want this, or no, we don't, as opposed to it coming back down to the local level and being required to look at a conditional consent. So.
We have some very astute members on the committee, and we've turfed back some severances and saying, go for a minor variance. We simply didn't want to say something without having the public input. And it was valuable.
Oh, extremely valuable. And it does give an opportunity. It's also somewhat of it's a different environment here as well too, and we do get a lot of turnout at the PDAC and Committee of Adjustment meetings, and so that level of engagement then helps inform the process at the local level first.
Just reminded me another thing that I wanted to explain in terms of our process within the office. We assign severances to individual planners on a county-wide basis. So, we're kind of the face of the county for you for planning, but there are other planners out there, and so it's quite possible that one of our quote northern planners. So there's a north team in addition to us, and then there's kind of a free agent planner that does policy and some development applications, Jameson, who you'll meet later today. So they might not have some of the local knowledge that we have, although we carry that back to them from PDAC when we attend the meeting, and of course your comments come in. But so there are a lot more people involved in that process than you might know. But if you're interested in monitoring a particular file, we do post the comments on our website prior to the Land Division Committee meeting. And our Land Division Committee meets, it cycles with Planning Committee, so it's usually the second Thursday of every month. So the posting is, I'm not sure exactly, but at least a week prior. And you can go on there and see what all the agency comments are, what the public submissions are. And at that point, we'd have our site photos and aerial photography. We go out and visit every site as well across the county and photograph them and such. So But I would say we have an example recently of someone that came in with drainage concerns after the fact, unfortunately. But we wouldn't have that knowledge, and it's difficult for us to suss that out if we're out on site in the winter. So if there are local circumstances that you think we should know about, then, pass those along, and we'll try to help support whatever you need to make sure that the development ends up being to your liking. So I guess I'll move on to site plans. So this is definitely the township driving the bus. The site plan control bylaw is a township bylaw, and that dictates when and where site plan is required for development. And it deals with detailed design before a building permit is issued. Some of the things that will be dealt with in a very detailed way would be grading and drainage, landscaping, site circulation, parking, environmental impact. And the technical review of all of those documents is completed by the township's consultants. And it also, site plans will come to PDAC as well. And I think generally for design review purposes, but when it comes to PDAC, I think we would often have the some of the other comments that have come in as well. But rest assured, there are lots of people in the background that are looking at those technical issues and agency commenting as well. And in terms of, I haven't talked about appeal processes yet, but for site plans in particular, they are appealable, but only by the applicant. So if they're unhappy with the township's decision or decision-making, they can appeal it. Not very common to have a site plan appealed because it delays the process so much. It's usually in the best interest of time and all considered to try to work out issues through the process. So the next slide just puts it all, oops, sorry. The next slide just lays out all of the different topics that I've covered. Any questions before I move into the next part of the presentation, which is more about planning in Puslinch and providing you with an example and walking through some of the nitty-gritty part of it?
In regards to that recent complaint about drainage on one of these lots, so that would have to be addressed in the site plan if someone were to apply for a building permit. So those concerns of the drainage would be addressed through the site plan before construction would be started. Is that a fair statement?
I'm going to try to answer it a little bit, and then I'm going to ask Michelle because I haven't been directly involved in it. But if it's a residential lot, it wouldn't be subject to site plan control because that's exempt. So that's where conditions on severances are key because we can, some municipalities, as a matter of course, they have standard condition checklists, and they will ask for a grading plan as a condition of the severance. But I'm going to...
Sure,
Yeah.
and further on that note, if it has been created by consent, if it hasn't been conditioned, it's going to be driven by the building permit process. And if the building official feels the need to request a grading plan, then that would be requested. And some of those details could be worked out then. But it is, just as Sarah mentioned too, if it's not something that's picked up at the during the consent process and firmly conditioned in, then there are some backups to catch it, but it may not entirely catch it too. So in the example that we're sort of chatting about, we do have additional information, so that may help inform the building permit process as well too. And I'm not entirely clear on the status of that one, but that just, generally speaking, that would be the two mechanisms that could potentially pick that up. And then the site plan question then, for everywhere that's regulated by the site plan control bylaw, Absolutely. The grading and servicing plan would happen as that complete, think more of a commercial type development or an industrial development, so there'd be a standard set of submissions. Rural residential lot creation doesn't have that same level of threshold unless an issue has been identified through the process.
You said that residential lots are exempt, but can't you just bump it up to request a site plan?
Well, that is in the Planning Act, so I'd have to look into that a little bit more, but yeah, do you have an answer for that?
So I don't freshly have on my mind the site plan control bylaw and the aspects of it, but certainly there are situations where you could request in residential situations for site plan control, keeping in mind that's a fairly extensive administrative process and that we don't have a framework for it at this point in terms of rural residential consents.
Exactly. That would really,
So you'd be leaving it up to the building department to assess the grading plans associated with the residential.
yeah. But there's not a requirement necessarily to submit grading plans with the building.
That's correct, yeah.
Only when CBO feels that it's necessary, so.
Yes, and you, as you mentioned, you will be providing more information to assist the CPO in any decision on that.
Sorry, I have a question. This thought of having minor variances take place before first. I've never thought of it that way, and the more I'm thinking of it just right now, it seems to make really a lot of sense. And I'm wondering if something that, this particular issue with the grading problem, would that be something that would potentially come up maybe earlier on in the game if we were having these minor variances first?
Well, that particular example was a straightforward severance. It wouldn't have
It
been.
wouldn't have been
It
a-
wouldn't have been picked up.
I got you.
But to be fair, we did make comments to the Land Division Committee with respect to concerns with the wetlands.
I think what I'll, without speaking directly to that particular file, what I can say is there are times where, unfortunately, people don't submit their comments within the comment deadline. So the neighbors are circulated on severance applications the same as minor variances. And they have an opportunity to comment and to attend the hearing if they like. And a lot of people do. But unfortunately, sometimes those comments don't come in. And if they don't, we can't deal with them, obviously, if they're not brought to our attention. And we don't expect the municipality to the PDEC won't necessarily be aware of local grading or drainage circumstances in every situation. Sometimes maybe, but sometimes not. So, yeah.
With the minor variances, I know that not every severance application would be subject to a minor variance, but it seems like more and more of them are, just because of the nature of what lots are left, I guess. But how would that approach, how would someone know, I guess, if that would be a condition that would apply on their lot before they apply for the severance?
Well, we encourage pre-consultation, and so when we have situations like that, and usually, I don't talk to surveyors, about their process, but I think they're pretty good about sending people to us to kind of double up and do another check-in before they file, and that's when we would typically identify that. In our professional experience, if we feel like it's not a good thing, then we would try to hit it. That being said, some people don't follow that advice, and they'll still submit for the consent first because they want to kind of see what happens. And so that's where you've got your check and balance where it comes to PDAC, and you, again, would be able to identify that whether or not we did, or whether we did and they chose to go a different route. Yeah, and if you, yeah.
I just maybe further add, Sarah mentioned about the consents really only getting more complicated and the so-called easy ones being gone. But I think probably historically, most did not have an associated minor variance or rezoning with them. And if they did, they probably, for the most part, were fairly straightforward. So sort of the tradition of the process, it may have historically made sense because some of the associated variances could have been fairly straightforward, and planning staff, in all likelihood, could have felt very confident that this would be an appropriate way to move forward. Now, what we're seeing, and Sarah certainly hinted at it, but with the additional provincial legislation, it's getting harder and harder to find a lot out there. And it is warranting much greater scrutiny and evaluation and review of policy. And then that's where we've really been noticing, like, we need to take a pause and maybe just say, let's look at it at the local level first, if there is this associated variance, and get that input and evaluation, and then that direction really from the local level to move forward to that consent stage. So it's definitely evolved even in my short time at the county, as we've seen new legislation come in and that evolution, and certainly the evolution of the lots.
Even within the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Absolutely, within the last 6
Yeah,
months.
I really like that approach because it seems to have a sort of a more grassroots kind of approach to it, because then, you know, the residents have an opportunity to speak on it and bring it to our committee and to our council before it goes to the county, instead of the other way around, because I think sometimes probably the feeling is once it gets down to this level, the decision's already been made. And so I think that probably gives people more of a, I guess, they feel perhaps more like their comments are being considered.
I totally agree. And I guess a couple of things. I'm not sure how many we've had that have gone in that sequence recently. What, 3 maybe? Yeah. So
There's some minor variances were straightforward.
Yeah.
The farmer's severed a piece of lot, and he when he has enough width for a driveway, and
Yeah.
it's in the middle of nowhere, nobody's going to get.
yeah. So I guess I don't.
Well, it's a judgment call.
Yeah, I guess
basically.
it's
If
on
in
an
the middle of
individual.
Yeah.
a highly residential area type of thing, you certainly want the input of the neighbors.
Yeah.
And I agree. Sorry.
Well, that's it.
Okay. That there is a perception that the decision's already been made. I would say, though, don't forget that if a condition fails, the severance does fail. So if they can't clear their condition, then they lose that severance. But it definitely does give that perception. And then it's harder to, it's set. The configuration is set because it's already been dealt with by the committee. So if you wanted to make any changes to it, it takes some of that flexibility away. So, yeah.
Just in terms of a process perspective, just for council's understanding, if the application comes in to Land Division and then it's reviewed at PDAC, so we get feedback from PDAC, and I would say for the majority of time, in fact, certainly in my time, our comments have been in sync. So if the deferral is requested from PDAC and the discussion ensues at PDAC and it's felt that the minor variance or rezoning should be dealt with either by council or committee of adjustment first, then what our comments typically are back to our land division committee is a request for deferral based on that discussion. So we're trying to ensure that the local input is represented to the land division committee.
All right. So maybe I'll step into the next. Oh, sorry. There. So I've got 5 more subheadings here. How are we doing? Look at all that time.
Just have a 2-minute break.
Yep, let's just take a 5-minute break.
There.
I know it's getting late.
right. So, just to make it a bit more, closer to home, I've got the project sample that I want to walk you through, a bit about design guidelines, and then more about just to make sure that you know what we do and some of the things that are coming up in the next year or so. I've chosen the Aberfoyle Snowmobiles development as a project sample. I'm figuring everyone's quite familiar with that development and its current location. It's a good example because it has a little bit of everything. I think they did almost every type of planning application. So that made it interesting for me for sure. What I did want to lay out is a little bit about all the different players in this kind of a setting where you've got these public applications. So you know us, and of course you are the decision makers here, but we have the applicant, and they have responsibilities to consult early, often. Hopefully, we don't require pre-consultation, but we encourage it. They need to justify their development and how they would meet provincial, county, and local policies. Of course, an important piece, and in this example, there was a lot of public input and concern around the development. So members of the public will provide their input, and normally it's around their own personal property and concerns around that and the broader community. And I would say that subdivision is its own community, and of course the broader the village as well. And from the county perspective, you have the public interest, which is includes that, but also the municipality in general. All of the applications that we deal with are circulated to required statutory agencies, and those are all laid out in the Planning Act. So you've got a lot of other agencies that are looking at these applications, like conservation authorities, even the province. When we have an official plan amendment, they will be circulated on those, and they'll provide their input based on their particular lens and interests that they're considering. And last but not least, you have staff here at the township, and also you've got peer review consultants that are looking out to make sure that their areas of expertise are covered off. And so that goes back to who's driving the bus, and you've got a few different things feeding into the process to help you make the best decision that you can. So here we had the official plan amendment, zoning bylaw. They also did lot line adjustment, site plan, and design guidelines also came into effect. So I start with a zoning map here. This was the zoning map that was custom tailored to what development they were looking at. But again, just to drive the point home, council can only consider new use if it's allowed by the official plan, and the official plan isn't like the zoning bylaw. It doesn't have the same, lists and lists of uses and definitions. It provides more broad direction on what types of uses can be looked at, and this front portion in particular, being in the central business designation, didn't allow for the Aberfoyle Snowmobiles development to happen, and so we considered the official plan amendment at the same time. What we do in those cases, because the county has the approval authority on the official plan amendment, is we try to dovetail them as best as we can so that they're processed together. And the township is good enough to host a joint public meeting, because it really makes sense to have it in the community and make it convenient for everybody to come together and look at both applications at the same time. And just to take a step back to pre-consultation, in this case, that's where we identified the need for the official plan amendment. And the applicant also presents, in this case, I wasn't involved at the initial stages, but I suspect that they probably presented to the Development Review Committee. And that's a staff committee here at the township that is held the first Thursday of every month generally. And so that brings together representatives from Conservation Authority, your peer review engineer, Hydro, Stan Denhode and Greg Scheifele. And then we would also attend, and your staff as well. So at that time, it's great because it allows for some cross-pollination between disciplines so that we're all aware of what some of the other concerns are. We try to identify red flag issues early because it's easier to address issues before they're married to their design. And once somebody has done a design, it just becomes more and more costly to have their consultant change the plans, and people they dig in. And at that time, we also identify the study requirements that are needed for a complete application. The province did change complete application requirements a number of years ago so that we give notice of a complete application, and sometimes you'll see it's a notice of complete application together with a notice of public meeting. That's when it's a fairly straightforward application and we feel like we can let the public know and get them to the public meeting. But in a situation like this, generally we would give notice of a complete application, put it into circulation, get the agency feedback and the technical feedback, public feedback hopefully, and try to work through technical or other issues before we would schedule a public meeting. Because if things are going to change, we would rather bring it back to council with some of the issues addressed. That doesn't mean that you can't have another public meeting as well. There are different ways to deal with conflict or disagreements or challenges, and we can certainly talk about that. In a typical rezoning situation, there would be a minimum of 2 planning reports from our office to council. The first is the information report, and that's a very, bare bones report for the public meeting because obviously it's a public meeting and we're not going to make any decisions before we hear from the public, and we certainly don't want to give the impression of anyone landing on any side of the issue until we know, and that's why you won't find a position in that report, and it just lays out general information for you. And then the recommendation report, that's when we get into summarizing and putting together the public concerns, the agency reviews, and hopefully the sign-offs that we have from the different agencies. And then we'll provide our planning opinion as well at the end. For some of you that might recall the reporting on this application, we ended up doing 3 reports. The last one was, the third one was because we no longer needed something called a holding provision, and so we were able to change the zoning bylaw just to streamline the process a little bit better for them. I think that's all I'll say for that, but do you want to add anything? Yeah.
The only thing I would add to that is Sarah's just discussing the information report, the public meeting report, and then the recommendation report. And if you think back to the beginning of Sarah's presentation and sort of all the different layers of the PPS, the growth plan, the official plan, down to the zoning bylaw, it's that report that we typically try to lay out the framework, the policies that we'll be reviewing the application under. So that's where you might see different statements of the PPS or the relevant policies of the official plan that we would be looking at. And so that's a good indication to council. This is where we're going. This is what we're going to dig into in our recommendation report, in addition to all of the feedback that we would receive from the commenting agencies, departments, and the public.
So for this particular report, I remember this was a little more on the challenging side for me because we did have a lot of neighbors, and maybe I need to be a little more steely in my approach to my work, but that weighs quite heavily on me when there are a lot of neighbor concerns, and then balancing that with the interest of bringing this longstanding business to a new location so that they can flourish and grow. So this slide lays out, it's my bringing it all together slide, and you're seeing a lot of words: consistency, conformity, compatibility. But the first three mention, it goes back to what Michelle was just saying. In our recommendation report, we should have a statement, and you'll see it, whether or not the application is consistent with the provincial policy statement. We use that word because that's the word in the policy statement, and that's the threshold or requirement that has to be met. Conformity with the growth plan and Greenbelt plan, again, that's the same language, and that's one of the other significant tests. And then conformity with the official plan as well. So there are a lot of moving parts and things that we need to consider all at the same time, and try to seek a balance that is in the public interest at the end of the day. The remainder of items on that list, I think it's dangerous to start to talk about, here's a checklist for what you should be looking at for development applications, and here's how you decide. But these are some of the things that we would more typically look at or might come up as an issue. Things like compatibility with adjacent use of land, that came up in spades in this development. Whether the land is suitable for what they're looking at doing, does it meet the technical requirements, drainage, are there any impacts at the bottom, risk of flooding, public health and safety? I mean, those are critical items. So I think we had a little bit of everything on this particular application. And the good news for you is that, it is a heavy burden to decide on these applications, but you have experts to advise you in engineering, your hydrology, hydrogeology, ecology, and planning. You've got good staff behind you that will be providing comments within their own areas of expertise, agency comments, and public feedback. So, the other thing I will say too is, as you know, applications vary greatly by location. So when people, sometimes we'll get inquiries where someone will say, I don't want to tell you where this is, but I want to do X, Y, or Z, and I'll say, well, I can't answer that. I have to know where it is. So that's why pre-consultation is so important. I would be amiss to not spend a little bit of time on the design guidelines. This goes back to 2010. I think it's a good example. Matthew was involved quite a lot in this particular project, but it's an example of something that I'm proud of that we all work together on. And you're still the only municipality in Wellington County with design guidelines in effect, which at the time I thought, wow, that's great. And so Centre Wellington still doesn't have theirs in effect as far as I know. They do have other design reviews that they do, but I think this still stands as a good example for a municipality of your size to have this kind of a document. And so it's meant to apply to the review of private development applications, but it also covers off the public realm, as we call it. So it's been used in recent EA discussions, and the way that it was devised is to try to make it targeted so that we don't put something through this kind of scrutiny that no one's ever going to see anyway. So if it's an internal industrial lot hidden in an industrial subdivision, it's not. These don't apply. But they do apply on Brock Road and some of the major development areas in the township. and they're available online, and it's meant to be a living document, so at some point, perhaps the township might want to look at a refresh. But I was really pleased to see the new bylaw brought in some of the suggested, there's one design guideline about having a minimum 3-meter landscape strip on Brock Road to try to improve that corridor, recognizing that it has a certain function to it, but we have to start somewhere, and so that's now enshrined into the zoning bylaw, which means that they have to do it or seek relief from it. So moving into us as county planners and what we do, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask us about our role. It can be a bit confusing at times for people. Particularly, we get a lot of calls, and it's a unique arrangement for people that aren't familiar with a county structure. A regional structure is maybe more familiar to folks and larger municipalities that have in-house planning staff. So I certainly think of myself as your planner, and I'm a phone call away. Just try to think of me as being in the office down the hall. You just can't see me. I don't create a lot of problems. But we're here for you, and we do regular office hours for municipalities that we consult for elsewhere in the county. So in Erin, Michelle and I have been doing half days. But we haven't done that traditionally for Puslinch because we just come when you need us, and that way it's more flexible. So if you need us a bit more sometimes, we come more or less, and I think it seems to have worked really well, and you're so close that it's really not a big deal for us to come down. So we deal with matters of provincial, county, and local interest. And so we wear our county hat, and we also wear our local hat when we're dealing with matters here. We appear as expert witnesses. With the new local planning appeals tribunal, it sounds like there might be a reduction in hearings down the road, but we haven't seen that play out yet. So severances, we were expecting great things, and then we have hearings, oddly enough, and we still have legacy hearings that we're dealing with here as well. So I guess so these things take time. It'll be a few years before we start to see what the new environment looks like, and whether we'll be doing more written affidavits and submissions rather than in hearings that are going to be happening, which are quite costly once you start bringing experts and lawyers. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I did hear recently that the support center, it's been closed. So, yeah, El
Better got
Paso.
launched.
Yeah. So I never got a chance to see what that was meant to be. It wasn't meant to be. It's gone now. So, so it's sounding a bit more like what it used to be. Yeah. So, and we last point here, we encourage pre-consultation. That's yeah. But I would caution and say, it's nice to have a good pre-consultation that's legitimate and, where people aren't just fishing. So, because then we get into a loop of doing multiple pre-consultations, or, I've had one where they had 3 different options, and, people also need to be accountable and responsible for bringing a complete amount of information to a pre-consultation meeting, especially if it goes to the site plan or the development review committee, because that's where everybody's being brought together, and we want to make a good use of everybody's time. So, what's coming up? I'm just going to go through a couple things that are coming soon to your council. Implementation of the new zoning bylaw, which we've talked about. So we'll be jumping into that. And one of the things that Karen has asked us to look at doing is something to make the implementation or make the bylaw more user-friendly. So it's a little add-on that we're looking at doing with our GIS folks so that you can use the zoning bylaw and click on a property and pull up the zoning or the site-specific zoning and then click through the bylaw in a user-friendly way, which I think is fantastic, and it's something we've already kind of done a demo, and we had someone in our office. They spent about 5 hours inputting some of the tabular information, and it seems like it's going to work quite well. So we're looking forward to that, and kudos to you guys for wanting to go ahead with that. Site plan control bylaw, some of you might recall that Kelly was working on that in the past, and so we're going to pick up where she left off, and hopefully in the near future you'll have that coming back. Community improvement plan, Karen, we're also going to be talking about that too. The county has done a community improvement plan, and if you want to be able to benefit from some of the some of the funding through that, you need to update your community improvement plan to allow for that to happen. So Karen's on top of that as well. And I know we had a really good, at least from my perspective, I love this stuff. And we had a really good conversation about the growth plan, about the amendment last time we were here. And the agricultural system and natural heritage system mapping is really key to Puss Lynch, and I wanted to try to provide a series of slides that illustrated it in a way that I thought might be more meaningful to you. It helped me, so I'm hoping it helps you too, and I'll just walk you through this. So this is your land use schedule in the county official plan. The beige is secondary agricultural, and that's where you have severance potential, subject to certain criteria. Okay, just to keep it simple. The next slide is going to show you so white is prime agricultural. That's where your prime agricultural land is now, not a lot. Look for the white on the next slide because that's the additional prime agricultural land that the province is looking at adding. Okay, so I'm going to do that again because it's so much fun. There. And then the next slide, I'm adding what's called candidate areas. And so within the growth plan, those are areas that could be one or the other. And so that is quite significant. And then the last thing I've added is the natural heritage system in the growth plan, which is quite telling. Like that pretty much shows you what we're dealing with, and we know, but I wasn't sure that the mapping that we had been looking at previously was quite showing what you needed to see. So let me just see what I had up after this. Isn't it? Yeah. So, yeah. What's that?
And if it was right, yeah, and if it was accurate, well, that's just the way it is, but
Yeah.
considering it's the errors, it's hard to accept.
Well, and I think what's interesting too is when you overlay the natural heritage system, there's only prime left. There are only a few little pockets of secondary. So so when we met last week and I presented. We're constantly working on this in the office, and Jameson spent an enormous amount of time on that amendment and providing comments on the amendment. One thing that I didn't speak to you about last time I came was that. You okay? The province has implementation tools for the agricultural system and the natural heritage system. Do you want me to wait or no, keep going? Yeah, okay. So I guess what I'm trying to say is Councillor Bulmer was asking me some pretty direct questions about, so are we going to get back to where we started on this map series? Are we going to get what we had in the first place? And the province still decides what the criteria is for us to go through the process of rationalizing where we end up. And that's and they still have the approval authority. So at this point, it doesn't look like there's uncertainty about whether or not we'll be able to use what we call the Lear analysis from years ago when you developed the secondary agricultural system, and the university was involved in that work. Wellington Federation of Agriculture, Aldo was involved. That goes back, I don't know, 20 years or more. Yeah, and there was a scoring system and site visits and a lot of detailed work that went into that. But if they won't, if we're not in a position where we can still use that information, there's a lot of uncertainty about still. I think the good thing is about the pause. The pause gives time for people to still benefit from that designation and maybe get some severances that are still achievable. But at the end of the day, I'll go back one. The candidate areas are a pretty significant piece here, and we'll have to look at what the ultimate criteria and direction is from the province about how we look at those areas and where they end up going, and whether or not there's also the flexibility to keep the secondary and not the prime that they put in, because they use the word refinements, and I looked that up in the dictionary. When it comes down to things like that and what that really means, and revision is a different word from refinement, and then you get into intent and purpose and everything. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, and you've all done hard work in the past, and we have too, in presentations previously to the province, to communicate inaccuracies in the mapping and concerns that we have. And but I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page and that you knew what that mapping ultimately looked like.
Can I ask a question, though? But you've mentioned the candidate area several times, and I was quite clear that where they've designated it one or the other, that refinement is unclear. But I guess I maybe understood that in the areas that were listed as candidate, that's where they wanted some additional study. And that was the whole idea, is that this is unknown, therefore it was more than just a refinement required for those candidate areas. There'd have to be some greater level of assessment there.
Yeah, I'm not in. I can't answer that right now. Yeah, I think it's dangerous for me to do that, and quite frankly, I know I've talked to you, Councillor Bulmer, about me changing roles, and so I've made a switch into I'm now the policy manager for Wellington County, and I'm still wearing my development manager hat and the policy hat, and I feel like my head is swimming with information right now, and not knowing until Amendment 1 happens, until we actually have a final version of that, and then if changes flow into the technical implementation documents, that could change too. And we did make comments about that when we commented through the environmental registry. So that could still change. Even if I could answer your question, it's not written in stone. Yeah.
Does the plan that you did for the county with the GRCA and other CAs that you're going to be talking to us about this afternoon, does that not give you some ammunition to get this changed? Like, it was done locally, it was done scientifically, it was done methodically, and this was done by somebody in Toronto. So do you not feel confident that will carry some weight to have this changed? Well,
I think, at the end of the day, I wasn't involved in that, and that's why Jameson is going to be coming and presenting that material. But I've looked at the mapping, and I can see, and also the stats table that shows you what proportion of even provincially significant wetlands that weren't picked up in their mapping versus our mapping. And if you look at the mapping as well countywide, in the northern part of the county, there's a lot missing. And then in our area here, there's a lot extra. So it's kind of odd, like how did that happen? So I'm hopeful, and I'm glad that we did get ahead of it, and we did do that work to try so that we would have something that, something credible that we can refer to as well.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what I think, because it is very, very good. And I don't know how they could argue with the local conservation authorities and the county planners that are hands-on compared to what this is.
And a more detailed or finer analysis, yeah. So I hope Jameson's presentation will help. That'll flesh out a lot of the details on that, because clearly, see how much fun I'm having? I really like mapping, but it's better backwards. But
If we were going like
right, yeah.
a reverse.
But clearly, that's a very different landscape than what we have. Okay. So, yeah, I don't have a lot of pictures in these, because what kind of pictures do you do for planning? But and that's not me balancing on a log, but it is a huge balancing act, and you can use all sorts of comparisons to juggling and different things, but it's clear, I mean, you all have a difficult job in everything that you do, because like I said at the beginning, the Planning Act isn't the only legislation that you deal with, and it's not the only legislation that touches on planning. There are so many overlaps. But what I wanted to kind of impart is just, some of the key questions would be, is it in the public interest, and understanding what that means. Does it represent good planning? And then I thought of this yesterday. If you aren't sure, you can defer. That's about as good as I get with rhyming, but take your time if you need to. Now, again, you don't want to defer everything, because then that slows down the whole process, and people like us might get a little cranky about that. But at the same time, if you have, a second public meeting, if it's a very controversial application, or if there's a technical issue and you just don't have a good answer, send it back, and we can, us or another expert can respond back. If it helps avoid an appeal in the long run, then that's definitely worth the time, because, as you know, appeals are costly and they take a lot of time. So in my experience, most developers do want to resolve issues, and they want to do that. But then you have other examples where there will be times, there are timeframes in the Planning Act, and if you don't meet them, they can appeal it. And sometimes that's unavoidable. Sometimes it's just not possible. I see that the province is wanting to streamline, so they might cut some of those review timelines, and I don't know what that means for us, because we still have to get the job done and do all the proper technical reviews. So it's a really interesting time for people like us, and I think it'll be there's just so much going on, and so much transition with the new government that I think we're all in the same boat. We're all going to be learning some new things and trying to absorb new policies and regulations. So this is only the beginning of that conversation. And then just to finish, we're here to help, and this is our contact information. Feel free to call us about our reports, or talk through Karen, and we're happy to help in any way we can.
All right, that's great. You guys are doing a wonderful job for us. I truly appreciate it. And
Thank you.
it is a troubling time, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I hope we're successful with this mapping. It's
Yeah.
very, very important to Puslinch and other municipalities. So
Yes.
fingers
Yeah.
crossed. Hope it works. Councillor Roth.
Do we know how many building lots are available in the township?
I almost could have answered that for you because I was looking at it yesterday, but we do track vacant severances.
Yeah, I remember when we reset the clock.
We were talking about that, darn it, because I thought you might ask, and I should have. I always try to
I know
guess.
at that time, I think it was Mark told us
Yes.
how many lots we had available, and there was a lot. There was a
It was
lot
over
at that.
200, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
you said.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
when this all came down from the Liberal government, then we had a real flurry of consent applications, and I'm sure a lot of them went through. So it would just be kind of interesting to see what our inventory is.
So your inventory of vacant or eligible or,
Yeah, like, how many new houses can we possibly get?
Are we talking about completed consents or possible consents?
No,
They're sitting there empty.
Sitting there empty.
good, because that's easier for me to,
Yeah.
to find out.
Well, it'd just be, and I don't know if we can do anything with that information, but it'd be nice to know
Yeah,
if there's 10 or 10,000.
yeah. No, I don't think you're right about that. It's between that. 10 and 2,000. Yeah, that's information that I can find for you, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Bulmer?
A couple of, it's interesting you talk about changing times. I can remember, I think in 2003, Mark Powell must have aged about 5 years in the policy tsunami.
He went gray,
back
yeah.
then. All the big changes that came in, and we survived.
Yep. Oh, yes, yeah.
But a couple of things. I really appreciate the talk about, when Michelle was talking about laying out things in the planning reports. I find those very valuable. Because I see the official plan as our sort of vision document and zoning bylaw as how we implement that vision. And it's often easy to see it as in a broader perspective when we're looking at updating the official plan or updating the zoning bylaw. But when we come down to specific applications, it then becomes less about whether it fits or the planning, in terms of when we're talking about people, then we start talking about people and, well, this person's a good person. We start talking about it's their approval or approval for them, as opposed to, we tend to lose sight of the fact it's actually it's the property that's gaining the approval, not the person who's made the application. And that sometimes gets muddied up in the public discussions. Is there any, I don't know, I try to remind people of that when talking about it. Is there any way we can help people understand it, that it's not, if there's questions, it's not about questioning the person that's making the application, it's the, this is forever on the property piece? You know what I'm getting at there? People often confuse that we're giving a person an approval as opposed to the property approval.
I think it's a really good point. I'm just trying to think, I know when, that kind of conversation would happen in pre-consultation when outside of your realm. I think people have a tendency to take it personally anyway, because it is their property, and I hear so often, this is my dream, and that just right, that gets me right to my heart, because it is, and it's
Understood.
so important, and so that's another heavy weight when things are difficult for people, or they don't fit at all, and call before you dig, that please call before you buy a property and put all your plans into it. It would be nice to be able to neutralize it and be able to look at it without the emotional part to it. But yeah, if I could figure that out, I'd probably sell books about it.
I mean, certainly from our perspective, I think sometimes I will advise that as a planner, we don't often get to be too involved in the emotional aspect, and sometimes we are here to present, well, we are here to present the facts, but certainly I know there's been a couple of cases over the past year where I've been before council that I think we've had the opportunity to tease that aspect out of it not being necessarily about the individual's desire to run their business, but the compatibility of the land use that they're proposing. So sometimes, certainly at the public meeting level or even at the recommendation report level, we can tease that out, and we might get an inkling that it's maybe leaning that way and can provide some perspective. I know we use the term, we don't people zone. It's,
Yes,
we
exactly.
talk about that
Doesn't run
sometimes.
with the ownership of the property, it runs.
Exactly, and how the zone, exactly how the zone will be in perpetuity until
Right.
such time as that it may be changed, but that it is tied to the property. So sometimes we can bring that aspect too, that, and certainly council can bring that as well too, but it's nicer maybe for us to take care of the somewhat drier stuff. And we maybe aren't winning popularity contests all the time.
I'm pretty sure we aren't.
Yeah, because we say stuff that people don't always want to hear. So that's, I mean, Sarah's right, we deal with that all the time. You hear of people's dreams, and unfortunately, we sometimes have to be the bearers of bad news.
Yeah.
And certainly, even in that regard, there's nothing like a board hearing or an LPAT hearing to solidify the planning process that Sarah started outlining with and going from the PPS, but then even going right up to the Planning Act and having the public interest and what that truly means. And I know the LPAT hearing that Councillor Rose sat in on for me, I guess back in the summer, there were some really good questions about what the public interest is, and aren't I part of the public? And we were able to actually, I asked the board member, I said, can I just pause for a moment and take the opportunity to explain? And I didn't want to get too planner talk, but I talked about the official plan being a document that's actually adopted by council, and council is actually voted in by the public. And so that document actually broadly represents the public interest.
Vision.
And so when we talk about conforming with the official plan and that the zoning bylaw, that you do have the right to amend that, but ideally, the application to rezone obviously needs to conform with the official plan, and that's capturing public interest very, very broadly. And it was very eye-opening for me being part of a hearing, and it is something that we hear lots is, what about my interest? What about I'm part of the public, I'm a member of the public, and certainly that is a very, very important aspect of it. But the policy that we were talking about at the time was a county-wide policy, and it dealt with just as we started this questions, but the number of lots and what people are allowed to have. So I think there are many points where we maybe take the emotion out of it and talk about the planning policies and how that actually does relate to public interest. But sometimes I think we can fall victim to we don't have the time or the space in our reports to always go through every aspect of our planning policy. So we do try to just identify those relevant ones that are really the discussion points and the drivers for the application before you. There could be other far broader policies, growth policies, for example. We might not always get into the details of that, but we can always talk about them and discuss them too. And if there was a request for more information in that regard, we always could do that too.
Well, thank you. It's interesting. I wasn't even thinking of it from the applicant's perspective in terms of I just assumed, of course, it's their dream, I'd be the same. I was thinking more of from often you hear from neighbors or letters of support saying, oh, this person's a really nice guy, why can't they have this?
Yep.
And yeah, that's the piece that, then those are the people I have to explain to, well, it could be someone else next week.
That's right.
And the nice guy might be gone, but I appreciate that, yeah, of course, it's even a bigger challenge when you hear from the person who's wanting to fulfill their lifelong dream. It only makes perfect sense. It makes your job even harder.
But I mean, it's, I appreciate what Michelle's added, that was way better than what I said. But when I do pre-consultations, and when we have our county hat on, I mean, we have to look at the lens of not necessarily precedent, but we kind of do, because if somebody can do something in a prime agricultural area in Puslinch, then in Mapleton, they're going to want to do the same thing. And there's no distinction between prime land there versus prime land here.
Yep.
So, that neutralizes it to some degree for me, some of the best successes I can have with an inquiry is when I explain that to someone and they're very unhappy, or they don't qualify for a severance because they're prime ag, but then they say, oh, okay, well, I understand that. I understand what you're saying. I don't like it, but, so there are definitely those moments. The other thing that I had meant to bring up is, sometimes you'll have enforcement, and that came up in the earlier session. One of the things that I like to keep in mind, and even for any inquiry, is, we should first be seeking to meet the zoning bylaw, rather than, if somebody has a violation. I think it's easy and sometimes appropriate to suggest rezoning, but not always. And so I think that's something that
Well, yeah,
we want to be careful
A
about.
slippery slope that
Yep.
then everybody just doesn't comply.
Yeah,
then
and
we
waits
just
to be
change the rules.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, especially, the fact that, the new zoning bylaw has been, you guys have approved it, essentially, and, that means a lot. And I haven't gotten into this too much, but, we're probably going to see less zoning bylaw amendments for a while, because you did do some pre-zoning. You've got, you allowed for some increased lot coverage, and so hopefully that'll stimulate development. And it's going to change the kind of applications that you might see. So maybe not as many rezonings. I would hope less minor variances. So, like we have a clean slate, fresh slate, new line in the sand. And so, if we start getting minor variances in to start reducing those new standards, or if somebody wants to modify a general provision that applies to the whole township, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And we want to honor your support of that document and be careful about how we proceed with that. On the other hand, to me, minor variances are like a canary in the mine shaft. They're an early warning system, and they tell us the areas that might need to be tweaked in the bylaw, that maybe that we may, maybe we didn't quite hit it right there, or it, and the businesses change, with technology and all sorts of things that we might not have anticipated or known of when the bylaw was first written. So yeah, it's.
Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you very much.
Very welcome. Thank you for having us.
And I guess we can call adjournment at 11:09. So